Almost everyone has heard of the Iron Curtain in the Cold War. It sounds as if there was an impenetrable wall between East and West. No contact, no exchange, nothing but official statements, mutual accusations, and threats. Yet even in the years of the sharpest political confrontation, cooperation and trade between these potential adversaries did not just survive, they worked at full speed. And one of the clearest examples of this paradox were the trucks carrying the name Sovtransavto on their cabs, the Soviet state monopoly for international road transport. From the late 1960s until the very end of the USSR, these trucks regularly crossed the Iron Curtain, hauling all kinds of goods in both directions. And at the peak of this story stood the Swedish Volvo F89, a machine entrusted only to the most experienced and most loyal drivers the system had. In this video, I'll show you how it happened that the front line of Soviet foreign trade ended up in the hands of Western trucks. The Soviet system produced plenty of paradoxes, things that today are almost impossible to comprehend. Take professions, for example. Jobs that now seem completely ordinary could, in the USSR, give you privileges, access, and status far beyond what a modern person would ever expect. Take taxi drivers. Today, just a service. But in the Soviet Union, a taxi driver was almost a person with a position. Soviet taxis weren't budget sedans. They were Volgas, and before that, even former government ZIS limousines could end up working as cabs. On top of a decent official salary came unofficial earnings. And if a driver worked in Moscow, around airports or big hotels, he could even get access to foreign currency, something rare, almost sacred by Soviet standards. All of this made a taxi driver's real social status much higher than that of an average worker. And yes, he could simply refuse a ride if he didn't feel like going there. That kind of everyday power was a rarity in the USSR. Union were also considered high-status specialists, and the job was paid accordingly. But an international long-haul driver, that was a completely different level, one that made taxi drivers and mechanics fade into the background. In the USSR, traveling abroad was difficult and available only to a very limited number of people. And naturally, becoming an international driver was something only a few could achieve. The requirements for Sovtransavto drivers were far stricter than for those working on domestic routes, because abroad they essentially represented their entire country. It's no surprise that the company's personnel department operated under the full supervision of the KGB. To join the company, a candidate had to prove not only his professional skills, but also his personal reliability, loyalty to socialist ideals, and the absence of any questionable connections. Family status also played a major role. A man who wanted to work on capitalist routes was expected to have a wife and at least 2 children, a kind of guarantee that he wouldn't choose to stay abroad at the first opportunity. Every approved driver received a strict briefing, how to behave abroad, whom they were allowed to interact with, and what kinds of contacts were to be avoided. And the path to the driver's seat was long. A candidate first had to spend several years working as a regular mechanic. Then came extensive training and exams. Access to international routes was granted step by step, first domestic work, then trips to other socialist countries. Only after successfully proving himself there could a driver be cleared for long-haul journeys to the West. To be accepted for the job, a driver had to meet several strict requirements. Pass a background check conducted by the KGB, have at least a basic conversational level of a foreign language confirmed through exams, have a minimum of 5 years of experience driving a tractor-trailer, and hold the highest professional qualification, provide a positive reference from the management at his previous workplace, possess theoretical knowledge of transport regulations in other countries. It's worth saying that this strict selection system really did work. While preparing this video, I couldn't find a single incident involving Sovtransavto drivers or their trucks, and their pay reflected that level of responsibility. A Sovtransavto driver earned around 500 rubles a month before bonuses, and with bonuses his income could reach 800 rubles. For comparison, an average worker earned between 150 and 200 rubles. A basic Moskvich 412 cost about 4,500 rubles, and a Zaporozhets was even cheaper at roughly 3,500. So yes, Sovtransavto drivers were very much part of the trucking elite. Getting hired by the organization was considered the equivalent of hitting the jackpot. The main thing after that was simple: stay sharp and don't slip up. The backbone of the fleet consisted of Soviet Maz 504 trucks. When they appeared in 1965, they were the most modern long-haul vehicles available in the USSR. Before that, intercity transport was handled by older Maz models, whose roots went back to wartime designs, and the level of comfort reflected that. Harsh suspension, noise, vibration, a cramped cab. For dump trucks or short route work, it was tolerable, but for long-distance runs, when a driver spent several days on the road, it was a real challenge. So the arrival of the rounded cab Maz 504 felt almost like a revolution. For the first time in years, designers had actually considered the driver and his living conditions. That's why, when the new enterprise Sovtransavto was established on July 11, 1968, the Maz 504 was chosen as its main tractor unit. There was simply no alternative. It was the only Soviet truck that met the requirements of long distance, let alone international transport. In addition to the Maz, a small number of Skoda 706 RTN tractor units were purchased. Both models had similar payload capacity and the same cab-over-engine layout, and it was these two types of trucks that were initially assigned to handle international routes. But 1969 brought the first unexpected problems. The planned 50,000 tons of cargo turnover for that year turned out to be impossible to achieve. The Soviet and Czechoslovak trucks simply didn't have enough power to handle such volumes. The company needed stronger tractor units with capacious semi-trailers, and, as mentioned earlier, nothing of that class was being produced in the USSR. The solution, however, arrived surprisingly quickly. In that same year, the Swedish company Linjebus contacted Sovtransavto with a proposal to open a regular transport line on the Gothenburg-Moscow route, with stops in Stockholm and Leningrad. The two sides reached an agreement rather quickly, and by October, regular freight service was up and running. For the route, the Swedes provided two-axle Volvo F88 tractor units with ASJ Force semi-trailers. This is how the first Swedish trucks made their way across the Iron Curtain. The Volvo F88 debuted in 1965, and it was the result of something Volvo had understood back in the early 60s. Long-distance transport was changing fast, and the standards that trucks of previous decades were built to had become completely outdated. They no longer met the demands of companies engaged in international haulage. Many manufacturers realized this, but Volvo was the one that moved to the front of the pack. The Swedes were among the first to build trucks that we would today call purpose-built for long-haul work. And the focus wasn't only on performance. Comfort mattered just as much. Drivers often had to spend days or even weeks in the cab, effectively living in the truck, so the working environment had to be as close to home as possible, with every detail taken into account. The technical side received equal attention. The F88 came with engines ranging from 200 to 312 horsepower and an 8-speed gearbox. Before the model's launch, Volvo carried out additional durability tests and significantly reinforced the chassis and suspension, improving strength and reliability. The designers expected the truck to do well, but even they couldn't foresee the scale of its success. The Volvo F88 became an instant hit, a truck that Europe's hauliers took to almost immediately. The Volvo F89 became the natural evolution of the successful F88. Engineers continued to refine the platform, strengthening the construction, updating the components, and increasing durability, simply developing the line step by step. Work on a new 12-liter engine had begun back in 1969, and this power plant became the basis of the next modification. In 1971, Volvo introduced the F89, the first Volvo offered exclusively with a turbocharged engine producing 330 horsepower. The truck also received a reinforced chassis and a 16-speed transmission instead of the previous 8-speed unit, allowing it to handle heavier loads and tougher operating conditions. In essence, the F89 was the same dependable F88, just with a significantly stronger technical core. In 1971, Sovtransavto received funding to purchase imported trucks, and the specialists immediately turned their attention to Swedish manufacturers. After comparing many options, they chose the Volvo F89 a three-axle version with a liftable rear axle and a reinforced chassis. Along with strong technical characteristics, Volvo appealed for its moderate price and excellent reputation. By that time, the F88s running the USSR Scandinavia route had already covered around 1 million kilometers without any serious issues. In 1973, drivers from the Sovtransavto Leningrad branch drove 27 Volvo F88 32s from Gothenburg to the USSR under their own power. Another 73 units were delivered to Moscow. All of them were assigned to work with French 24-ton semi-trailers. The trucks carried the distinctive white and orange cab paint scheme and the Sovtransavto logo on the doors. It goes without saying that Volvo immediately proved its reputation inside Sovtransavto. The reliability was phenomenal, and the working conditions inside the cab were on a level that Maz and Skoda trucks simply couldn't come close to. Getting into Sovtransavto was already difficult. Only the best drivers were accepted, but those who ended up behind the wheel of a Volvo were the best of the best. In terms of status and prestige, they arguably even surpassed the famous Magirus drivers on the Baikal-Amur mainline construction, whom I've mentioned in one of my earlier videos. 2 years later, the Soviet side purchased another batch of 150 trucks, and in the following years, the fleet continued to grow by at least 50 units annually. By the late 70s, after the introduction of the Volvo F12, the USSR began buying that model as well. And it's hard to say which one earned more affection from drivers and ordinary people, the classic F-series or the new generation. Most likely both were loved equally. In 1989, the Soviet Union imported the anniversary 1000th Volvo F12. By that time, the trucks from the earliest batches had covered 1 million kilometers or more. Their appearance was no longer fresh, but technically, they remained in perfect working order and kept running reliably. No longer on international routes, but on domestic long-haul lines, they performed without any issues. Volvo trucks weren't the only foreign machines in the Sovtransavto fleet. In 1975, the company purchased its first batch of 100 Mercedes-Benz L2232S tractors. In 1979, Mercedes signed another contract with the USSR, this time for 300 additional units. By the late 1980s, Sovtransavto operated around 1,500 Mercedes trucks, making it the most numerous foreign brand in the entire fleet. And yet the real paradox is this. It wasn't Mercedes, but Volvo that became the symbol of Sovtransavto, the truck most people associated with the company, the one drivers considered its true pride. Sovtransavto also purchased several Iveco models and tested trucks from various other European manufacturers, though none of those trials led to full-scale procurement. The Sovtransavto system, operating under the main directorate of the USSR Ministry of Road Transport, lasted until 1988. By the beginning of Gorbachev's perestroika, the company had reached its peak. In terms of international freight operations, it ranked among the largest carriers in the world. And then, the breakdown began. The country that had created this transport giant was collapsing before everyone's eyes. By 1991, Sovtransavto included roughly 15,000 employees, 34 branches, a wide network of service stations, parking facilities, and logistics hubs. But legally, all of this suddenly belonged to no one. There was no longer a central authority capable of coordinating operations. Each newly independent republic simply nationalized the part of Sovtransavto located on its territory. The unified structure ceased to exist. What's truly remarkable is that the Sovtransavto brand survived the collapse and still exists today. Of course, nothing remains of its former power. The golden years are long gone and won't return.